Welcome to the Free Speech Nation podcast with me, Andrew Doyle. Today, I'm delighted to welcome my guest, Jacob Muchangama. Jacob is a lawyer, a human rights advocate, and the former external lecturer in human rights at the University of Copenhagen. We discussed free speech for very good reason, because Jacob has a new book out. It is called Free Speech, A Global History from Socrates to Social Media. It was a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. So a lot of the debates at the moment seem to be around big tech and big tech censorship. A lot of people would say that it's not censorship if Silicon Valley decide to boot people off their platform if they don't happen to agree with their viewpoints. To what extent do you think big tech censorship is comparable with state censorship?
Yeah, from a purely legal point of view, of course, those who say it's not censorship are typically right. You would need some kind of rules for content moderation on platforms. But I think that in these debates, people forget or overlook, in my view, that free speech is not actually only about laws and constitutional protections and human rights. Even more importantly, arguably, I would say, is the culture of free speech. So this was something that John Stuart Mill was very clear on in On Liberty. He writes in chapter 2 that it's not only it's not sufficient to have protection against the tyranny of the magistrate, but also you also need protection against society's tendency to impose its views on dissenters. And George Orwell wrote some of the same things. He said that during World War II, the British government hadn't been overly censorious. The main threat to free speech actually was that the fact that most newspapers were owned by a few wealthy men, and also that the intelligentsia had these orthodoxies and red lines that you were not allowed to really cross. And I think that's instructive for us in our age, because free speech is exercised on these platforms. So if you have really unclear rules and that discriminate on the basis of viewpoints, then that will de facto affect freedom of expression, and therefore it is a serious challenge to free expression when you suddenly have a huge increase in the number of comments that are deleted for vague and unclear categories like hate speech or disinformation or dangerous persons or whatever.
When it comes to those bad ideas and what we now describe as hate speech, does censorship ever work?
That's a very good question. And I guess that depends on your perspective. If you're Joseph Stalin, then censorship is quite good. If you're Xi Jinping, censorship seems to be working quite well. But democracies, obviously, even those who argue in favor of hate speech laws in democracies would acknowledge that free speech is a fundamental value. And so there are limits to how far you can go. In the book, I write about what I call the Weimar fallacy. And so this is the idea which underpins a lot of laws against hate speech, specifically in Europe, that the Nazis gained power through democratic means, even if they never gained an outright majority, and therefore democracies have to be militant. They have to crack down on totalitarian ideologies before they gain enough power to crush democracy. But as I show in the book, there was actually a lot of censorship in the Weimar Republic. So Hitler was banned from speaking. Newspapers started by Nazis like Joseph Goebbels and Julius Streicher were frequently banned, or these editors were punished, but they used it very cleverly, the Nazis, to further their own propaganda. And I think most worryingly is the fact that the Nazis used the emergency measures of the Weimar Republic that were supposed to protect democracy to ultimately abolish it. So they used emergency laws to basically suspend freedom of expression, freedom of association, and so on, which allowed them to build a one-party totalitarian state. Now, this is not to say that without restrictions on free speech, the Nazis wouldn't have gained power. It's just, I think if you in a democracy argue that censorship is necessary, I think the burden of proof should be on you. And my reading of that particular history suggests that cracking down on totalitarian speech with the restrictions and censorship was not an efficient remedy. And you also see it in in the UK with the in 1965, when sort of introduction of hate speech laws, and I think one of the very first persons to be prosecuted was a black nationalist who had said something about white people, and there were a number of black nationalists who were prosecuted in the first day. So that also shows that these laws will often be used against, will always be defined and enforced by those who are in power, who are the most influential, and therefore minorities will always face the risk and be vulnerable. So they'll only be a majority away from being the target rather than the beneficiary of laws against hatred and offense.
Isn't this the problem, that whenever you have hate speech laws on the statute books, they're always formulated with such a vague and nebulous language? We have the Communications Act in this country, which talks about how if you send material online that is grossly offensive, that would constitute a criminal act. But of course, who on earth knows what grossly offensive means? And recently we've had the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, saying that she would like to see laws in place to criminalise jokes that she finds distasteful if they're broadcast on Netflix, say. So once you have these things established in law, there's no knowing where they can go, who they will be used against. And from my familiarity with hate speech laws across Europe, no one seems to agree what hate actually means.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that in many ways these laws are impossible to draft with sufficient clarity, and our subjective biases means that they can be sort of turned against very different groups. And it's interesting that if you go to Joseph Stalin's Soviet Constitution of 1936, it promised to prohibit hate speech. So it's something that totalitarian states can also use to limit free speech, and have done enthusiastically. But and of course, if you go to Russia today, hate speech laws can be used. We've seen how hate speech laws are being used, for instance, to protect the Orthodox Church against satire and mockery. And the West, there seems to be this scope creep of hate speech laws that they apply to broader set of groups. And some of these groups might then use them sort of against each other. So it could be, religious conservatives against trans activists, and vice versa, who attack each other and try to sort of say that their respective ideologies are hateful. And this undermines, I think, because in many ways, free speech is the antithesis of violence, right? It's what allows people with very different ideas about the good society, deep philosophical differences, religious differences, to live together in peace, which is something that not so long ago in history was rare. We couldn't live together in peace. We thought we had to impose our views on dissenters, otherwise society wouldn't hold together. Free speech is really the antithesis of that. So I think it's quite incredibly sad to see this idea gaining hold that the social peace needs to be built on restricting certain forms of speech, when in fact I think speech is what allows us to live together in diverse societies, and especially what protects minorities and traditionally oppressed groups, give them a voice, give them a stake, an opportunity to claim equal justice and tolerance, whereas censorship and restriction have typically been used by dominant groups as a vital tool for oppression and marginalization. And I think we've unlearned that lesson, unfortunately.
That seems to me to be where we are living in unprecedented times, because whereas, as you point out, in the past, censorship has always been, or typically been, for the consolidation of power by elites or oppressive groups, or the powerful groups. Whereas now we're seeing the most skepticism about free speech that I'm seeing, the people who want to see the First Amendment modified so it doesn't incorporate hate speech, for instance, all of this is coming from people who are saying that we are doing this in order to protect the vulnerable, protect the marginalized. In other words, is there a conflict between the rights of minorities and the rights of everyone to say and think as they wish?
No, I think it's absolutely the other way around, and I think one of my favorite champions of free speech was the American abolitionist and orator Frederick, who himself was born as a slave but ran away and became one of the most efficient opponents of slavery, and he gives a great speech in 1860 called a Plea for Free Speech in Boston, because he was about to give this speech at an abolitionist meeting, and it was heckled, disrupted by these white slave owners, not slave owners, but white Bostonians who thought their commercial interest would be jeopardized, and he gives a speech which really counters all the modern arguments against free speech. He says that free speech is incompatible with slavery. It will defeat slavery. In another speech, he says that the right of free speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed. And he gives a universalist defense of free speech. It doesn't depend on the color of your skin or the size of the wallet. It rests in the simple quality of manhood, and there let it rest forever. But you also see it. It's not so much to do with minorities, majorities per se, but you see, related to this argument that minorities are threatened by free speech is the argument that free speech entrenches unequal power positions. And I think British colonialism is a great example of the contrary. So if you go to colonial India, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi was sentenced to 6 years in prison for sedition in 1921 for having had the nerve of writing some newspaper articles criticizing British rule. And Gandhi gives this great speech in trial where he basically argues that everyone should have the right to criticize political systems or influential people up until such a point where they advocate or promote violence. So Gandhi at the time has a more expansive conception of free speech than what followed under British law and also under American law at the time, because at the time in America, if you were a socialist or against involvement in World War I, people were sentenced to 10 or 20 years in prison. Unfortunately, what we see today in modern India is that these colonial era laws that limit hate speech or blasphemy and sedition are now being used by the Indian government to crack down on dissenters in India. And you also see British-style sedition laws, colonial ones in Hong Kong being used in the crackdown on democracy activists there. We saw how hate speech laws in apartheid South Africa were used to protect apartheid from criticism. And of course, one of the reasons why the First Amendment offers such a uniquely strong protection in the United States is because the civil rights movement was instrumental in expanding the protection of free speech by winning a number of landmark cases that really expanded the ability of the civil rights movement to use free speech and freedom of association to make the case for against segregation. So John Lewis, the famous congressman and civil rights leader who died not that long ago, said that without free speech and the First Amendment, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. And again, I think this is something that is completely missing this perspective from the debates around hate speech today.
Doesn't it feel a little bit like that argument's been lost, though, when you have groups such as the ACLU, who, of course, historically have been so committed to the notion of free speech, now saying that actually they don't really believe in free speech anymore because it can damage minority groups? That appears to be the belief, and a lot of sort of free speech groups and free speech activists appear to have gone down that route. And it seems to me that they have kind of betrayed those liberal principles upon which those organizations were founded. Do you think I'm right about that?
Yeah, I think there's still strong civil libertarian believers in the ACLU who does fight for free speech. But it's certainly true that within the ACLU, there's seems to be this split that not everyone is committed to that traditional ideal of free speech that once was sort of the pride of the ACLU. And you also see it very clearly when you look at attitudes towards free speech in America, for instance, where younger and more progressive liberal generations are much more skeptical of free speech that offends minorities and more supportive of laws to limit hate speech. So where once it was sort of liberal orthodoxy that tolerance and equality meant tolerating racist speech, that is no longer the case to the same extent. And I think one of the reasons might be that, we tend to take free speech for granted. Those of us who are lucky enough to have grown up with it and not having to fight for it in the same way that the previous generations had. So if you were not, if you were a minority today, you were not among those who, were being hosed down by policemen and harassed and imprisoned for fighting for racial justice. And I think it's very human that we take the benefits of a good like free speech for granted, whereas and then sort of have focused solely on the harms and costs of and ugly sides of free speech, which are there and have been amplified by social media. We have to be honest about that. But I think that we tend to adopt measures that where the cure is worse than the disease, and we will find that if we really if we drastically continue to limit free speech, I think we will start to see consequences that we didn't imagine, and that will be very prejudicial to some of the values that we really like and appreciate in open democracies.
To what extent, then, do you think it is a generational difference? I mean, I continually find myself reading conflicting reports on this. Occasionally, there's a quite alarmist survey which talks about how substantial proportions of younger people think it's okay to silence those they disagree with or who cause offence. There's even been surveys suggesting they believe that acts of physical violence are sometimes acceptable against those who say offensive things. So. And then, however, I talk to young people in universities and things like that, and I see a very open-minded idea to the idea of free speech. So what is the reality here?
Yeah, I think it probably depends also on surveys. What exactly do they ask? One of the things that I find is that even in countries with very different cultures than Western ones, if you ask straight up, do you support free speech? We did a study like this in 2021. Most people will say yes, they think it's a very important principle. But then, when you ask to specific, supposedly conflicting values, you get very different ideas of where the limits on free speech be. So you could have students who are very committed to the idea of racial justice and equality, who actually believe strongly in free speech, but then have these limits on where specifically on racism, but who would not be in favor of censoring communism, for instance, or even though you could argue that that's also a totalitarian ideology. So if you want to crack down on one evil, why not the other? So that does not mean, I think, a wholesale abandonment on free speech. It just means that in an increasingly polarized world, I think people of different ideologies and tribalist inclinations have their various red lines, and the totality of that is that we eat away at the concept and culture of free speech from different sides, leaving the center increasingly weak, and also because I think when one side starts to adopt restrictions on free speech, it incentivizes the other side, if you like, to go down the same route and use it for their purposes. Also because if you're afraid that if you're no longer in government, the other side, your political opponents will then come into office and then use restrictions on free speech to limit your opportunity to gain power again, then you might be able to persuade yourself that you need to crack down on free speech in order to protect democracy and your own side. And I think that's a very dangerous development.
To what extent do you think a lot of this has come about because of the new wave of what we might call social justice activism, which has its roots in this postmodern worldview that our understanding of reality is entirely constructed through language. And therefore, if you take that through to its logical conclusion, language in of itself can be a form of violence. You always hear that phrase, words are violence. Do you think that there is that sort of connection between that ideological movement and the rise of free speech skepticism?
I would think that that might be influential in academic circles, certain academic circles. I'm not convinced that this is something that has mass appeal, at least not to at the very sort of intricate, abstract theoretical level. So I think, certainly among some universities and academic circles, that is influential, and that might have an outsized influence on debates, given the prominent access of academics to the public sphere. But I think, more generally, I just think that, as human beings, we, our default mode, our default software tilts towards intolerance, and then we've developed this great patch that called free speech and tolerance built on top of it, but that constantly needs to be protected, because otherwise our default installation mode will override it and will tilt back towards intolerance. And I think we're all vulnerable to that. So it's not only social justice. You also see in the U.S. context, for instance, increasingly, Republicans adopting these bills that will try to limit history and issues on race and gender, even in higher education, which is very much the same intolerance impulse, just with different targets.
I know we're running out of time, so I just want to sort of wrap up. But I wanted to ask you about, you've written this book now at, I think, an opportune time to do so, because it does strike me that free speech is something that needs to be defended continually in every new generation. It's not a battle that ever really goes away, and it's important to restate the case. Are you optimistic that the liberal worldview will ultimately win out?
It's a difficult question. I don't know. For some reason, I am, because I think free speech is such a powerful idea, and I think that there'll be sort of a point when people start to see, if more and more laws are being adopted, I think people will start revolting, and when they see that it has consequences for themselves, that sort of the limited idea of harm that they had in mind when they supported restrictions on free speech actually might affect themselves, or ideas that they find completely harmless, I think people will start to revolt. Of course, there's a huge challenge with authoritarian states, the rise of China, and so on, which poses challenge. But that, ironically, may also be a rallying point for liberal democracies, in the same way that during the Cold War, many Western democracies looked at themselves and said, free speech is part of our identity. Maybe the confrontation with China will serve as a rallying cry to see, free speech is really what sets us apart from Xi Jinping's digital juggernaut. So for some weird reason, I am actually optimistic.
Oh, what a nice positive note to end on. Jacob, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Andrew. Really enjoyed it. Thanks. Bye.
This has been the Free Speech Nation podcast with me, Andrew Doyle, and my guest, Jacob Mchangama. It's been a slightly shorter episode this week because we had a few technical issues. I hope that doesn't bother you too much. Please do come back next week when I'll have another fabulous guest. And of course, like and subscribe and do all the usual stuff like that. Oh, and check out Jacob's book. It is called Free Speech, A Global History from Socrates to Social Media. That's available as of next month. See you next time.
Welcome to the GBNews YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.